It begins with quiet, a hush upon the land as though all the wind in the world had wandered elsewhere, leaving only the slow breath of earth and sky. In the twilight of an old land, where the hills of Ulster curl like the backs of sleeping beasts, and the rivers move with a silver patience, tonight's story comes to life. Not loud, not sudden, but like a fire lit in silence. This is the tale of a warrior's end, of Cuchulainn, the Hound of Ulster, and the calm before his last battle. If this story has brought you a moment of peace, let your support be known with a gentle click to subscribe, and more myths will come to find you. Now, come closer. Let the fire warm your feet. Let the night be kind to your breathing, and listen. For this is an old story, carried like a song across centuries, waiting only for your stillness to awaken. In the days of High Ulster, long before time was measured in hours and minutes, the warriors of the Red Branch Hall stood as fierce as thunderclouds and proud as standing stones. They were not kings, not always, but their strength ruled the land more surely than crowns, and among them there was one who outshone the rest. He was born as Setanta, with eyes like pale stormlight and the strength of men twice his age. A boy who leapt and spun, whose spear danced as if it had always known his hand. But it was the name he earned, not the one he was given, that followed him into legend, the Hound of Cuchulainn. He had slain a smith's fierce guard dog with his bare hands, and to atone, he took its place, swearing to protect the forge until another could be raised. From that day on he was no longer Setanta, he became Cuchulainn, the Hound of Ulster, loyal, fearsome, unshakable, and for a time he was all that Ulster needed. When the armies of Connaught surged eastward like a storm, seeking to break the spine of the land and claim the brown bull of Cooley, it was Cuchulainn alone who stood in the gap, holding them back with nothing but courage, guile, and the bite of his blade. But that was long ago, and every warrior, no matter how fierce, must one day feel the sky begin to dim. Now he stands older, though not bent, weathered, though not weary. His hair, once a blaze of golden red, now threads darker at the roots, and his face, though noble, carries lines shaped by storms both real and remembered. The halls of Macha, once echoing with the laughter of champions, are quieter now. Some comrades have gone to earth, others have faded into old age, their swords left to rust beside cold hearths. Only Cuchulainn remains as he was, bound not by time, but by Giasa. A Gies is not a curse, though it may carry sorrow. It is a sacred thread, spun from the soul and tied to fate. To break one is to unmake a part of oneself. To keep them, even unto death, is to walk with honour. Cuchulainn's Giasa were many, but two mattered most now. He must never eat the meat of a dog, for he was the Hound, and sacred things must not consume their own, and he must never refuse hospitality no matter who offered it. These bindings would never let him rest, not truly. There were whispers on the wind that day, a softness in the air like breath held too long. The bards sang quieter, the ravens circled closer, and from the west dark riders stirred the grass, their armour gleaming like storm clouds, and their weapons catching the last of the sun. Cuchulainn felt it before he saw them, a weight beneath his ribs, not fear but the shape of foretelling. He had dreamt of this day long ago, though dreams were not always to be trusted, and yet something in the bones of the land hummed with warning. Still he did not waver. He walked the fields alone that morning as was his way. The dew clung to his boots, and the heather brushed against his legs like the touch of forgotten ghosts. He paused often, not because he was uncertain, but because he understood the rhythm of things. A warrior nearing the end does not hurry. He listens. Birdsong drifted low, quieter now, as though the creatures of the field knew to speak more softly. He looked to the hills, remembering the first time he rode down them with the Red Branch at his back. They had laughed then and shouted, their weapons bright and their hearts brighter. He remembered the scent of iron and the red banners snapping in the air. There had been love in that ride, the kind born not of gentleness but of shared fury and purpose. Cuchulainn closed his eyes and breathed. He did not think of glory. Glory is for the songs, not for the moments that earn them. He thought instead of Emma, his wife, fierce and beautiful, who had loved him not as a legend but as a man. He thought of his charioteer, Laeg, loyal even when the roads ran red, and he thought of the Morrigan, the shape-shifting goddess who had come to him in many guises. Crow, maiden, wolf, wound. Some say she cursed him, others say she loved him, but the truth is less clear, as all truths are when woven with gods. He walked until the sun passed behind a veil of pale cloud, and then returned to his home. The fires were low. His weapons rested quietly in their places, the spear guy bolg, barbed and waiting, and his shield dark with the dents of 100 wars. He touched each in turn, not with reverence but with familiarity. These were no longer tools of glory, but extensions of himself, like breath, like memory. That night he dreamed again. He stood upon a riverbank, watching the water turn to blood. Ravens flew in a slow circle above him, and the trees bowed in the wind. From the shadows came a voice, not loud, but full of knowing. "Will you still stand, Hound of Ulster, when none stand with you?" He didn't answer in words. He stepped into the water, knowing it would rise, knowing it would take. The morning came cold and bright, the kind of brightness that feels thin, as though the sun itself mourns what it must reveal. A rider came from the east, eyes dark, armour strange. He bore a message. War was coming. Not the old kind, not Connaught, not cattle raids or border fights. This was something deeper, meant for him alone. The sons of his enemies had returned, warriors trained not for conquest but for retribution, and with them rode Lugard, the son of Cuchulainn, once slain by Cuchulainn's own hand. Vengeance burns hotter than justice, and Lugard's fire had burned a long time. The land grew still, and somewhere in the distance the Morrigan watched. The morning air clung to the land like a fine mist, neither cold nor warm but suspended, like a breath not yet released. Ulster stretched out before Cuchulainn, quiet as the inside of a church, the soft rustle of wind in the tall grasses the only sound to mark the passage of time. He had risen early, though he had barely slept. Dreams had come and gone like the wings of birds, fragmented, winged things that fled at the first light. He stood at the edge of the field behind his home, his gaze tracing the hills to the west where shadow pooled at the feet of the mountains. Somewhere beyond those ridges his enemies gathered, the sons of those he had broken, those whose kin had fallen to his blade. He had always known it would end this way, not in peace, not in some quiet withdrawal into age, but in a final test, a last reckoning. And yet there was no fear in him, only stillness. He turned slowly from the fields and returned to his house. Laeg was already awake, tending to the chariot. The horses, Leath Masha and Dub Sainglen, pawed the earth restlessly, sensing what approached. War horses knew. They always knew. Laeg looked up as Cuchulainn approached, his eyes full of both love and dread. He had served beside the Hound for years beyond counting. He had driven the chariot across muddy fields and red-soaked valleys. He had seen Cuchulainn fight under both sun and moon, surrounded and alone, laughing into the teeth of fate. He had believed the man could not die, and yet now that belief trembled like a leaf. "You've felt it too," Cuchulainn said, his voice low, calm. Laeg nodded. "They come for you, with curses on their tongues and murder in their hearts." Cuchulainn ran his hand along the neck of Leath Masha, who nudged him with a breath like smoke. The air between them was familiar, warrior and horse both shaped by the forge of battle. "I will not run," he said. "You never have," Laeg replied. The preparations were simple, as all true things are. He donned his armour piece by piece, each plate and strap a part of the ritual, the cuirass, etched with wolf designs, the greaves and braces blackened by age. And last, the cloak, red as autumn fire, clasped at his shoulder with the brooch of the red branch. His weapons were gathered with care. The gabolg, that cruel and sacred spear, rested in its oiled wrappings until he took it in hand. Forged from the bones of a sea monster, it was said to wound not just flesh, but spirit. None who had faced it had lived to speak of it. None save the gods, and even they gave it distance. He carried also his javelins, long and light, for the opening moments of battle, and his sword, a straight, broad blade without ornament, its edge whetted to a whisper. They did not speak much as they rode. The chariot cut through the morning mist like a ship at sea. The wheels hummed over the wet grass. The horses moved in near silence, trained long, ego to match their master's mind. Cuchulainn stood at the front, his spear tilted toward the horizon, his gaze set upon the hills ahead. As they passed through small hamlets, the people watched from doorways. silent, still. No one hailed him. No cheers rose. They had seen this man ride to war too many times, and now, with the sky grey and the wind shifting, they understood what this ride meant. A boy ran from a field to watch him pass, barefoot and wide-eyed. He had never seen the Hound of Ulster before, only heard the songs. He expected something larger, brighter, but what he saw was a man, tall, yes, and terrible in his quiet way, but also tired, not weak, never that, but resolved. The chariot passed without a word. They reached the ford by midday, the place where so many battles had begun and ended. The water ran low, autumn stealing its volume, but its voice was clear, rippling across the stones like whispered warnings. Cuchulainn dismounted, stepping down onto the earth. Laeg began unfastening the gear, preparing the camp. They would rest here, not because there was time, but because stillness was part of strength. The sun filtered through sparse clouds, its light slanting like gold across the fields. From here, Cú Chulainn could see the tree line beyond the far ridge. He knew they were out there, Lugaid and the others, watching, waiting, perhaps afraid, perhaps eager. He sat by the water, placing his hand in the current. It was cold, not biting, but insistent. The kind of cold that made one remember where they came from. A crow landed nearby, watching him. Its head tilted slightly. Then another came, and another. The Morrigan, perhaps, or merely her eyes. Cuchulainn smiled faintly, without joy. "Come to see it end?" he asked softly, "or come to make it end?" The crows did not reply. They never did. He sat there a long time, breathing with the wind. Laeg brought food, bread, some cheese, dried meat, but Cuchulainn ate little. His thoughts wandered instead. He remembered Ferdia, his foster brother, his friend, the one who had died by his hand beneath a sky filled with sorrow. That battle had torn something deep inside him, something that had never quite healed. There had been no victory that day, only grief, and blood in the river. He remembered Scathach, the warrior woman who had trained him in the land of shadows, her voice sharp as her spear, her teachings cruel, but true. She had taught him to kill, yes, but also to think, to listen, to feel. Her lessons lived in every movement of his hands. He remembered his son, Connla, a child he had never known, slain by mistake, his identity revealed only after the fatal blow had landed. That memory burned. It always had, and always would, yet none of it weighed him down. He bore it all like a cloak, heavy, yes, but chosen. When the sun sank lower, the crows took flight, a black spiral against the silver clouds. "Q," Chulainn rose. "Tomorrow," he said to Laeg, "they will come." Laeg nodded. "Will you stand alone?" he asked, the words quieter than wind. Cuchulainn turned to him, eyes calm. "I always have." That night sleep came late. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent and ancient. The fire burned low. The air smelled of peat and river grass. Somewhere, an owl called. Cuchulainn sat by the flames, his spear beside him. He did not sleep, but he closed his eyes, breathing with the dark. He felt no dread, only the sense of things closing, not violently, not cruelly, but with the inevitability of tide and season. The story had been long, but all stories must return to silence. He whispered a name. "Emma." And somewhere, far away, the wind carried her reply. Carried. Dawn came slowly, veiled in mist and the hush of anticipation. The sky wore the soft grey of waiting, not yet storm, not yet light, as though the heavens themselves held back, unwilling to break the stillness. Fog coiled low across the riverbanks, spilling over the stones like a shroud, and the breath of horses hung in pale wisps as they shifted uneasily at their posts. Cuchulainn stood alone beneath the bare sky. He had not slept, nor had he needed to. His body had long since passed the point where rest could restore it. What stirred within him now was not strength but clarity, a kind of bone-deep knowing that came only to those whose time had narrowed to a single path. He fastened his armour without ceremony. Laeg offered assistance, but the Hound only raised a hand, gentle, final. "I must dress for my own death," he said. Laeg looked away, jaw tight. He busied himself with the chariot instead, tightening straps that needed no tightening, brushing down the horses though their coats already shone. He knew better than to argue. To love a hero was to walk always beside farewell. The spear, Gaibolg, was last. Cuchulainn wrapped his fingers around the shaft slowly, feeling its weight settle into his palm like a heartbeat. His barbed head caught the dawn light, and for a moment it glowed with the pale colour of winter. Then, from the trees beyond the ford came the sound of hooves. They came not with drums or horns, but in quiet formation, their armour dulled, their faces drawn. The army of Lugaid, sons of those Cuchulainn had slain in wars past, each bearing not the banners of a kingdom, but the burden of long-held vengeance. Among them rode Lugaid mac Cúroi himself, tall and shadowed in blackened steel. His eyes were cold, his voice colder still. "Cuchulainn," he called across the river. "You killed my father." Cuchulainn did not reply. He stepped forward instead, the spear gleaming at his side, his cloak settling behind him like the tail of a flame. "You are late," he said quietly. Lugaid's jaw tightened. This day was promised. "No," said the Hound, "not promised. Earned." The two armies, if they could be called such, faced each other across the ford. Behind Cuchulainn stood only Laeg, and the chariot, and the horses who would never again run from battle. Before him stood dozens, perhaps more. Trained fighters, armoured and blood-bound. The odds were no worse than they had ever been. He stepped into the river. The water came to his knees. It was colder today than yesterday, Brodidur, as though the earth itself had drawn back. Each step was deliberate, every movement an echo of the hundreds he had fought before. He was not rushing toward death. He was walking toward it, head high, as a man walks into his own legend. The battle did not begin with a signal. It began with silence. Then the first challenger stepped forward. Urk MacCairbrae, tall and wiry, a spear in each hand. Cuchulainn nodded once and they began. The clash of their weapons rang like distant thunder. No wasted movements, no taunts, just the sound of steel meeting steel, of feet shifting over stone. Urk was fast, clever, but he was not the Hound of Ulster. Within moments, Cuchulainn found the opening, a twist of the wrist, a shift of weight. Urk fell into the river, unmoving. Another came, and another. The pattern repeated, each one sharper than the last. But Cuchulainn fought like the river itself, fluid, relentless, unstoppable. He had not forgotten a single lesson. Each blow was clean, each breath measured. For a time it seemed as though he could not fall. But the tide was not on his side. Lugaid had not come unprepared. He had conspired with the Morrigan, it was said, gained knowledge of the Hound's Gieza, and now the traps were being laid. A woman appeared on the bank, ragged, stooped, her hands trembling. She carried a bowl of meat steaming in the morning chill. A gift, a meal, and Cuchulainn, bound by honour, by the sacred law of hospitality, could not refuse. He took a single bite. The meat was dog. He knew it at once. The taste struck him like ice. A shiver ran through his veins. He lowered the bowl and turned away, the weight of broken guys settling in his chest. From that moment he was not the same. His strength, once endless, now stuttered like a flame touched by wind. His steps grew heavier, his vision blurred at the edges. The battle continued, but the tide was turning. The next warrior to challenge him struck not at his blade, but at his shield arm. The blow landed hard. Another followed, aimed at the knee. Soon blood flowed down his leg in thin rivulets, darkening the river. Still, he stood. Still, he fought. But now he knew. The end had begun. He turned to Laeg as the next wave of enemies gathered. "Bring me to the stone," he said. Laeg hesitated. "You are not yet done." "Bring me," Cuchulainn said again, his voice like the low toll of a bell. The stone stood upon a hill not far from the ford, a tall, weathered pillar older than Ulster itself, set there by hands forgotten to time. Some said it had once marked a sacred boundary. Others said it had watched over every king who ever rode to war. To Cuchulainn it would now serve one final purpose. Laeg helped him from the chariot, supporting him gently. The Hound leaned heavily on his comrade's shoulder. Each step was labour now, the wounds biting deeper, his breath ragged. They reached the stone. With the last of his strength, Cuchulainn took the straps from his shield and wound them around the pillar, binding himself upright. The cords pulled tight, holding him in place. His knees buckled, but he did not fall. His head drooped, but his eyes remained open. He stood facing the battlefield, unmoving, unbroken. The enemies below paused, confused. Was he dead? Was this some trick? One by one they approached, carefully, watching, waiting. But Cuchulainn did not move. Even in death he stood. It was only when a raven landed softly on his shoulder, the Morrigan, some whispered, that they knew he had passed. And still, none dared approach. Not for hours, for the Hound of Ulster even in silence was feared. Even in death he was a warrior. Evening came slow to the hills of Ulster, as if the sky itself grieved and could not bring itself to close the day. The sun fell behind the ridges in hushed increments, casting long shadows across the land, soft reaching fingers of gold that dimmed into indigo, and there, at the crest above the ford, Cuchulainn still stood. Bound to the standing stone, his body held upright not by breath or will, but by the final strength of his hands and the cords of his shield. The wind had stopped. No birds called. Even the river had quieted, its current slowed as if listening. Below, the warriors gathered in uneasy stillness. They had won. They had taken him. But no song rose. No cheer was heard. There was no triumph in it. Lugaid stood among them, his sword still drawn, but untouched by satisfaction. He stared up at the distant figure, silhouetted now like a monument carved from dusk, and felt nothing he expected to feel. Where was the release? The justice? The righteous fury? He had waited years for this, for revenge to be sealed in the blood of the Hound, and now it felt hollow, as if something vital had escaped him in the moment of his victory. One of his men, braver than the rest, stepped forward and began to climb the hill toward the body. The others watched, breath held. Every eye was on him. They watched not in triumph, but with the cautious awe men feel when nearing sacred ground. He reached the stone, the man did, and moved with care, circling to face the warrior bound there. And then, Cuchulainn's sword arm, slack and deadened by death's embrace, shifted. Not much, just a tremble, a stir. Perhaps only the last twitch of muscle and spirit leaving the body. But it was enough. The man screamed and fell back, tumbling down the hill in terror. And that was enough too. Enough for them all to falter, enough for the whispers to rise. He does not die, not as others do. It was Laeg who returned to the hill, his steps heavy with sorrow. The chariot stood abandoned by the river, its wheels stained from battle. He climbed with hands clenched, his face pale, lips drawn tight. The man he had followed through 100 wars, the friend, the brother, now stood fastened to stone, empty and yet eternal. Laeg stepped close, laid a hand against the Hound's breast and waited. No breath, no warmth. The body had gone cold, and yet something lingered. Not presence, perhaps, but an impression, as if even death had not the right to carry him fully away. Laeg knelt. "You held the sky back, my friend," he whispered. "You held back the tide with only your hands." The silence that followed was not empty. It was sacred. As Laeg unfastened the cords and let Cuchulainn's body fall gently to the earth, the sky changed. Above, the clouds parted, not dramatically, not with thunder, but slowly, reverently, like curtains drawn aside in a temple. A shaft of light fell across the hill, and in it the crows came, dozens, perhaps more, silent, slow-winged. They circled once, twice, and then descended, not to pick, not to scavenge, but to witness. The Morrigan walked among them, unseen, or so it said. Some say she was there, in the shape of a pale woman with hair black as stormwood, her face streaked not with tears, but with the ash of mourning. Others say she hovered as a shadow just beyond sight, that she placed her hand upon his shoulder in death, as she had in life, and claimed his soul not as an enemy, but as one who had always belonged to her. For the Morrigan had never truly been his foe. She had been his fate, and fate is never cruel. It is only certain. The people of Ulster did not speak loudly of that day. In time, stories grew. Some said he had died smiling, others that he had shouted his own name before the final blow. But those who were there, Laeg and the soldiers of Connaught, and the quiet earth itself, knew better. He had died in silence, with no cry, no curse, no plea. He had simply let go. When they buried him, they did so beneath the hill, in a tomb marked not by grandeur but by stillness. No king's barrow, no warrior's hall, just stone and earth and sky. Laeg placed the guy bolg beside him. though part of him feared it would stir again. Even in death, the spear seemed to throb with memory. He covered it in cloth, tucked beneath the hound's folded arms, and sealed the tomb with a stone carved only with the hound's sigil. No name, no date. The wind returned days later. It came soft at first, as though testing the hollowness of the world without its hound. Then, slowly it reclaimed the fields, rustling grasses lifting the skirts of trees, brushing over the hills like fingers remembering a lost lover. And the land sighed. For a long time after, Ulster did not speak of war. Children were told the tales in lowered voices, and the warriors of the Red Branch, those few who remained, walked quieter paths. The hall of Emain Macha dimmed. No great feasts, no songs of glory. Only stories murmured by firesides and dreams filled with the echo of hooves on stone. But his presence did not vanish. It lingered. In the curve of the hill where he made his last stand, in the wind that passed through broken spears, in the whisper of crows in flight, and sometimes in the silence before storms, old men said they heard him, not shouting, not laughing, but breathing, as if the land itself had taken him in. The seasons moved on, but in Ulster the passage of time was no longer measured by harvest or solstice alone. It was counted in the stillness of the land, in the soft way the grass grew taller where the chariot no longer passed, in how the air changed near the standing stone, now untouched by warrior or wind. The silence that followed Cuchulainn's fall was not one of emptiness. It was full, profound, and wide as the sky. A silence that listened as much as it lingered. And those who lived in the valleys and hills began to speak of it differently. They did not call it grief. They called it presence. There were no longer war bands sweeping across the fields, no skirmishes at the ford. Even the armies of Connaught, victorious as they had been, left quickly, their banners packed away without celebration. For though they had defeated the man, the land had not surrendered. Something ancient had woken with his death, and it watched. In Emain Macha, the Red Branch Hall, the walls that once rang with laughter and steel now held quieter tones. The warriors who remained, old now or broken, would sit in the longhouse near the hearth, their voices low, each word wrapped in memory. They spoke of Cuchulainn not with reverence alone, but with familiarity, for he had been one of them, laughed with them, bled with them. And though the bards had begun to shape his story into legend, these men, these companions, remembered the man, his sharp temper, his loyalty, the way he could fall into brooding silence before a battle, then explode into laughter when the first spear flew. They remembered his fierce joy in small things, the gallop of his horses, the feel of the wind over the fields, the weight of Guy Bolg balanced perfectly in his hand. Emma did not return to court. She vanished into the wild, some said, into the quiet spaces of Ulster where grief could breathe and memory could soften. There were those who claimed she built a cairn on a lonely hill, placing stones for each year of their love. Others whispered she spoke only to the wind, her voice carried to wherever he now walked. But no one saw her again, and none sought her. Her mourning was her own, sacred and unspoken, like the hero she had loved. The Red Branch disbanded not with ceremony, but with age. One by one the warriors drifted away, to family, to solitude, to rest. There were no more great wars, no more single-handed stands. Ulster became quieter, its edges softened, and in the place of glory came reflection. The tomb on the hill remained untouched. No one dared disturb it. No grass grew over the stone, no snow lingered in winter. It was as if the earth itself kept vigil, warm, watchful, waiting. And above it, the crows circled still. In time, people began to visit the site. They came not as pilgrims, but as seekers. Some carried nothing, others brought offerings, smooth stones, pieces of cloth, small trinkets left in silence. They said little, but stood long, listening to the wind, the stillness, the memory. Bards came too. They walked the riverbanks where he had fought. They traced the tracks of the chariot in the softened earth, though none had remained. They climbed the hill and sang not of his power alone, but of his loneliness, his oaths, his sacred contradictions. And when they returned to their halls and firesides, they told a new kind of tale. They did not speak only of his battles, though those were still remembered. They spoke of his geasa, the sacred obligations that shaped his end. They explained how the fates of heroes are not simply written in strength, but in the strange and winding paths of honour. How Cuchulainn, bound by sacred rules, had stepped into death not because he was weak, but because he would not bend. He had not broken his word, not once. He had never refused a guest, never abandoned a vow. And in the end, it was those same bindings that undid him. Such is the shape of heroism in the old tales, not perfection, but devotion. Not ease, but endurance. Celtic wisdom held that the soul did not vanish with the body, that what is brave and true becomes part of the land, woven into stone, water, tree, and air. That those who fight for their people, who bear the weight of their name without faltering, are never truly lost. Cuchulainn had become that truth. His name, carried on wind, his silence carried in dream, his figure standing still beneath closed eyelids at dusk as if watching over those who remembered. And some nights, when the moon hung low over Ulster, and the fields lay cloaked in silver quiet, children claimed they heard the echo of hooves on old stone. A chariot rolling across the ridge, wheels creaking faintly. A figure in crimson cloak, tall and terrible and calm, and a spear, gleaming softly in the dark. Night settled like a hush across the land. Not sudden, but slow, like sleep seeping into the corners of a weary mind. The sky deepened to velvet, stars prickling the dark one by one, each a quiet sentinel above the fields of Ulster. Far below their cold light, the hill where the Hound of Ulster had fallen remained untouched, unlit by torches, guarded by no blade nor shield, and yet none trespassed. It was said that wolves no longer howled near it, that owls flew a wider circle, that even the foxes avoided its rise, not out of fear, but out of something older, something closer to reverence. The winds there blew differently, not louder, not colder, but with a weight to them, as if they carried words unspoken. And within that wind, if one listened long enough, there were whispers not of death, but of endurance. A generation passed, then another, but Cuchulainn's name did not fade. It settled deeper, like roots in stone, not taught in schools, for there were none then, but passed from mouth to mouth, fire to fire, voice to voice. Grandmothers murmured his tale into the ears of sleeping children, their hands smoothing hair as they spoke of the hound who stood when all others fell, of the warrior who bound himself upright so that no enemy might see him collapse, of the bloodied figure tied to a standing stone facing death with quiet defiance. In time, he became more than a memory. He became story, and story in the old way is not less than truth. It is more. It is the shape that truth takes when the world needs meaning. And so, the name of Cuchulainn became the wind over fields, the rustle of leaves in twilight, the breath held before storm. He was invoked not with the bluster of glory, but in quiet moments, before a journey, before a test, before standing alone. They would say, "Let the hound walk with you," not as prayer, but as a reminder that even in the face of certainty, the closing fist of fate, the breath of death hot upon the neck, a man may still stand, not because he must, but because he chooses. Those who studied the old text came later, poets, scholars, scribes. They arrived with parchment and ink, searching for the bones of truth beneath layers of tale. They combed through sagas, pieced together verses, argued over dates, meanings, lineage. But those who lived closest to the land, the shepherds, the peat cutters, the weavers, needed no such certainty. They did not ask whether Cuchulainn had truly held back an army alone. They did not debate the nature of Gaibolg, or whether the Morrigan had truly come in crow form to watch him fall. They knew what mattered, that there had been a man once, wild and beautiful and terrible, who gave everything he had and more, who obeyed laws older than kings, who met the weight of fate not with protest but with poise, and in knowing that they found comfort. There was a kind of peace in believing that one could meet their end as he had, not fighting against it, but walking toward it with clear eyes, making of it something dignified, something sovereign. It was a quiet peace, the kind that comes not in the moment of triumph, but in its echo. Lieg did not return to the courts of men. After burying the hound, he took the chariot and the horses, Liath Masha and Dub Sengland, and disappeared into the west. Some say he rode until the wheels gave out, then walked until his feet bled, Others claimed he returned to Scarthax Island, bringing word to the shadows. But the most whispered tale is this, that one evening, many years later, a figure was seen standing upon the farthest western cliff, the sea roaring below. Beside him, two grey shapes stood silent, their eyes like old fire, their muscles thin but still coiled with memory. And just before night swallowed the horizon, the figure raised his hand, and the wind grew still, and all the birds along the coast fell silent. Then he was gone. No one found a grave. No one ever did. In those years that followed, the land began to change, not violently but slowly, as all deep changes do. Ulster softened. Its wounds, once raw and red, became scars, beautiful weathered marks that reminded the people not only of what had been lost, but of what had mattered. Stone circles were raised in the Hound's memory, not tall or ostentatious, but simple and deliberate, carved only with symbols, a running hound, a spear, the outline of a raven's wing. They were not worshipped, they were remembered. That was enough. And travellers, even strangers, when passing near those places, would often pause without knowing why. The air would grow still, the world would seem to listen, and they would find themselves stopping, breathing slower, lowering their voices, as though stepping into a room where something sacred had happened. Because it had. There was a woman once, years later, who walked alone through the fields where Cuchulainn had fought. She was neither bard nor warrior, just a weaver, known for her quiet hands and the way she sang to herself while spinning. One day, while collecting reeds near the ford, she came across a small stone set upright in the grass, not marked, not placed by any hand she knew. When she touched it, she said, the air changed. She heard the sound of hooves in the distance, the creak of a chariot, and a voice, not loud, not near, but clear, say only, I did not fall. She told no one, not at first, but she began to weave differently after that. Her threads became bolder, her patterns more sure, and her children would find her, many evenings, standing alone at the door, staring west, as if waiting not in sorrow, but in recognition. The days passed gently, as they always do after the ending of something great. Nature, indifferent to the triumphs and tragedies of men, rolled onward. Grass grew green again where blood had once dried in the soil. Birds returned to sing at the river's edge, and the sun resumed its slow, patient arc across the wide Ulster sky. But even as time pressed forward, there were places it did not wholly touch, and in those places Cuchulainn remained, not in form, not in flesh, but in something deeper, something that clung to the air like the scent of wood smoke in old stone, something that hummed beneath the fields where his chariot wheels once scarred the earth, something that stirred faintly in the bones of those who heard his story and felt, without knowing why, that they were not quite the same after hearing it. The tomb on the hill, simple as it was, became the heart of such a place, and though no kings decreed it, no druid blessed it, no law preserved it, people came, quietly, one by one. They came in the earliest light of morning, their cloaks still damp with mist, leaving offerings not of gold or jewels, but of remembrance, a sprig of yew, a handful of blackthorn berries, a scrap of red cloth tied to the low-lying hawthorn trees nearby. Things of the land, things the Hound might have known. No one ever stayed long. To linger too long in the presence of such a story was to feel the weight of it pressing close, not cruelly, not unkindly, but with a depth that made words falter. It was like standing beside an old tree struck by lightning, still standing, its bark charred and powerful. You felt your own smallness beside it, your own silence. Yet the story continued to breathe. In distant villages, far from Ulster's green hills, Cuchulainn's tale took on new colours. Some sang that his mother had dreamed of a hawk before his birth, a sign he would fly above all others. Others said he'd been raised by spirits, that he learned to speak to beasts, that the ravens had fed him scraps of fate from their black beaks. These were embellishments, yes. But in each there lived a single thread of truth, that Cuchulainn was not merely a man. He was what happens when love and fury, fate and will, are woven into one, and what is woven cannot be easily unravelled. The Druids, too, remembered, though their temples were stone and sky, and their lore older even than the Red Branch itself, they kept a space for the tale of the Hound. Not in doctrine, there were no shrines, but in teaching, in how they spoke to those who came seeking wisdom. To walk the warrior's path, they would say, is to carry your own end beside you. The Hound did not fear his death. He knew its shape, he accepted its weight, and so it could not break him. For to the Druids, death was not an end, but a return, and Cuchulainn's return had already begun, in the dreams of children, in the voice of storm, in the flash of a red-tinged hawk high over the fields, too swift to follow with the eye. One such child, a shepherd's daughter born long after the battle, came to dream of him often. She never saw his face, but always the cloak, that vivid red, flickering at the edge of her vision. In her dreams he stood on the riverbank, watching something far beyond the water, his form tall and unmoving, his spear resting beside him like a second shadow. She spoke of him to no one, not at first, but she began to walk the fields differently. She stepped more lightly, she listened more deeply, and once, when wolves circled her flock beneath a full moon, she did not run. She stood still, eyes open, unshaken. The wolves left her untouched, and in the silence that followed she heard hooves faint and distant crossing unseen ground. The old women of the village, hearing her tale years later, only nodded. The Hound walks still, one said, stirring the hearth. Not as he was, another added, but as he must be. For some stories do not end, they only settle, like ash into earth, like breath into memory. And Cuchulainn's story had settled deeply, not as a warning, not as a hymn, but as a stone in the foundation of the land itself. If you walked the quiet hills of Ulster at dusk, alone and far from the trodden path, and the wind caught you just so, you might hear it, the faint creak of wheels, the stamp of hooves, the breath of a horse too large to belong to any living beast, and a presence, not hostile, not warm, just there, the Hound, riding the edge of night, watching as he always had. In the cool hush of early autumn, when the leaves had begun to bronze and fall like memories loosed from the trees, a storm gathered far off the northern coast. It did not come with fury, nor did it rage. Instead, it moved in quietly, a low, persistent swell of grey cloud and sea mist, rolling in like an old sorrow returning home. By the time it reached the hills of Ulster, the wind had grown softer still, as though it too were remembering. That night, under a silver-dripped sky, the land fell silent once more, and beneath that silence a deeper rhythm could be felt, the kind that comes not from the earth alone, but from what has been left behind in it, the rhythm of Cuchulainn's tale. It had passed through fire and war and centuries of whispering mouths. Now it echoed in ways almost imperceptible, in the stillness of a shadow, the way water curved around a stone, the moment of pause before a name is spoken. And names mattered. In old Irish thought, a name was not just an identifier, it was a vessel of the soul. To speak someone's name with care was to keep them close. To speak it with reverence was to honour their memory. To remember it, even in silence, was to keep part of that soul alive in the world. So the name of Cuchulainn endured, not shouted from mountain tops, not carved into monuments, but spoken softly across firesides, carried from mother to son, from elder to child, like a thread passed hand to hand. And those who spoke it would sometimes feel something pass through them, a sudden weight in the chest, a warmth behind the eyes, a stilling of thought. As if, for a moment, the world around them slowed, not in sorrow, but in recognition. The name had power still, and it moved through the land like a hidden river. South of the old tomb, near the border where Ulster's wild fields gave way to softer valleys, there lived a man named Conall, a smith by trade. He had never worn a sword, nor held a spear, and his hammer rang only for tools and horseshoes. But in his small cottage, nestled near a stream, he kept a single object that had never touched flame, a broken shard of iron, rusted and strange, said to be found near the ford where Cuchulainn made his last stand. It was curved, unnaturally so, and rough in the hand, but when he held it, Conall said he could feel something hum beneath his fingers, as though the iron still remembered the shape of battle, or grief. He did not display it, he did not speak of it often, but sometimes, on clear nights, he would place it on the earth beside the fire and sit in silence, listening. Not to voices, not to spirits, but to the stillness that follows a story so large, the world must grow quiet just to hold it. One night, in that quiet, Conall's young daughter asked him a question. Was he alone, she said, her voice soft, when he died? Connell did not answer at first. He stared into the fire, watching the way the flames bent around, the shard of iron. Then he said, "No." She looked up, surprised. "His charioteer was with him," Connell continued, "but that's not what I mean. When Cuchulainn died, the land watched. The sky held its breath. Even the wind stood still." He paused, then added, "There are ways of being seen that go beyond sight. He was not alone." The girl said nothing more, but she curled against her father, the story settling into her bones as it had settled into her father's before her. In another village, far from Connell's fire, an old bard lay dying. He had sung many tales, of Fionn, of Deirdre, of the cattle raid of Cooley, but his voice now was thin, like parchment stretched too far. Yet his last words were not for kings or lovers. They were for the Hound. He whispered them into the darkness, not as performance, but as farewell. He tied himself to the stone, so they would never see him fall. Then he was gone, and in the silence that followed, the breeze stirred the corner of the room just gently, like a hand smoothing a blanket. All across the land, pieces of the story lingered. The spear was said to be lost forever, hidden in the earth, or taken by the gods, or swallowed by the sea. But children sometimes claimed to find glints of it in riverbeds, sharp flakes of iron that rang faintly when struck against stone. They would hold them close, eyes wide, half in fear, half in awe. Some believed the Morrigan still walked the woods in crow form, her feathers darker than night, her eyes older than time. Those who glimpsed her often found themselves changed, not harmed, not blessed, but marked by some quiet knowledge they could never quite name. And the chariot? It was gone. But the sound of its wheels, they said, could still be heard in certain places, always at dusk, always just out of reach. The creak of wood, the snap of reins, the soft thunder of hooves, as if the Hound rode still, not as a ghost, but as a memory with purpose. A guardian, perhaps, or simply a witness, because that is what he'd always been. Not just a shield for Ulster, not just a warrior of terrifying power, but a watcher, one who saw the land as more than territory, one who bore its fate in his chest, not as burden, but as vow. And so the tale turns now slowly, toward quiet, not toward sorrow, toward rest. The first frost came quietly to Ulster that year, drawn over the land like a veil of glass. It kissed the blades of grass with silver, curled into the branches of bare trees, and softened the river's edge to ice. In the hush of that frost-bound morning, even the birds waited to speak. And upon the hill where the Hound of Ulster had fallen, the frost did not linger. It melted as it touched the tombstone, as though the earth remembered warmth there, or perhaps as though something still stirred beneath. Not a ghost, not a breath, but an imprint. Cuchulainn had left more than a name, he had left shape. Some things, when lived fully, when burned into the heart of the world with enough fire and grief and purpose, never entirely vanish. They become a pattern the world remembers how to trace. And so it was that his story returned, again and again, not always in form, but in spirit. There were those who rose in later years bearing no bloodline from him, yet moved as he had. Fierce, faithful, quick to anger and quicker still to defend. Farmers who stood alone against encroaching warlords. Mothers who faced down hunger without complaint. Poets who wrote as though words were spears and silenced the battlefield. And when asked how they could endure so much with so little, they would only say, "I remembered." Sometimes remembering is a kind of armour, and the Hound had taught them how to wear it. The land bore marks of him still. The stone at the ford became worn smooth over the years, not from time, but from hands. Visitors, pilgrims, strangers. They would place their palms against it, each without needing to ask where exactly he had stood. The energy there was unmistakable, not violent, not triumphant, but settled. A stone does not mourn, it contains, and this stone contained the weight of one final stand. A man, wounded and alone, who had fastened himself upright not to defy death, but to meet it on his terms. He had not raged, he had not run, he had stood. There is a peace in such knowing. And that peace spread over time like light beneath the surface of water. In the deep woods beyond the ford, where mist lingered longest and sunlight always seemed to arrive slower, there lived a hermit named Breeze. He had no titles, no followers, no temple. His home was little more than stone walls and a thatched roof, hidden among the roots of old trees. But those who lost their way sometimes found themselves at his door. He did not offer answers, he offered stories, and among them the tale of the Hound was told again and again, not always the same, not always in sequence, but always with a certain reverence. A stillness would come over Breeze as he spoke it. He would fall silent in certain moments, as though waiting for something unseen to pass by, then resume, quieter. He could have called for help, Bress once said to a wounded warrior who'd stumbled in from the wild. But he didn't, not out of pride, out of choice, because some paths must be walked alone, not for glory, but so others won't have to. The warrior slept beneath his roof for 3 nights. When he rose to leave, his wounds half healed and his heart steadier, he took nothing with him but those words, and they carried him. In far Connaught, even there, the land once stained by war with Ulster, his name softened. Time dulled the edges of hate, and what remained was awe. Bards began to sing of him not as a foe, but as the fiercest guardian ever faced. The storm before the silence, they called him, the fire that guards the root. Children who heard the tale no longer knew which side he'd fought for. They only knew that he had stood alone and had not flinched, and even those born into rival bloodlines whispered his name when fear crept too close. One such child, a boy named Enoch, once dreamt of standing stones in a ring, each humming with low, quiet power. At their centre stood a figure cloaked in red, his face shadowed, but his posture unmistakable, not imposing but present, watching, as if waiting for something, or guarding what had already passed. Enoch awoke with tears in his eyes, though he could not say why. That morning he began to carve wood into the shape of a hound, not fierce, but steadfast. The stories changed, of course. They always do. Some said he'd never died at all, that the Morrigan had carried him away whole into the other world, that he rides still just beyond the vale, a spear of flame at his side and war horses wreathed in mist. Others said he was reborn, again and again, in the form of those who stand alone when standing alone is all that's left, that he walks in those who guard what they love without needing to be seen. But the truest stories are not about what happened. They're about how it felt, and the tale of the Hound felt like standing at the edge of something vast, the space between what must be done and what will be done, that breathless place where fate is no longer abstract, but real and present and carried in one's own hands. Cuchulainn carried it, and when he fell he carried it still, until his breath was gone and his bones were bound to the land. And even then, he did not fall. Winter, when it finally settled over Ulster, came not as a brute force, but as a soft stillness, the kind that gentled even the hardest stone. Snow fell like the memory of sleep, slow and even, covering hills and valleys alike, softening the ridges of long-forgotten wounds. The land held its silence well, and beneath the frost, beneath the hush of windless nights, beneath the layers of earth and myth, the story of the Hound continued to breathe, not loudly, not visibly, but like a coal beneath the ash, never fully cold. In the deep white quiet the tomb remained. No snow gathered upon it, as if the air above still held the warmth of something watching. Animals passed it by in wide circles. Even hunters, when walking near, would instinctively lower their voices and unstring their bows. For it was not a place of death, it was a place of completion. Cuchulainn had lived as few had lived, and died in a way that shaped the world around him. There was no statue, no triumphal arch, but there was stillness, and in that stillness a lesson as fierce as any blade. Now, in the hearts of those who carried his tale, that lesson had settled like snow on stone, quiet, certain, enduring. A woman named Maeve, not the Queen of Connaught, but a hedge-dweller who lived among herbs and whispers, walked once a year to the stone. She carried no offering, no prayer, only silence. And when she stood before the place where the Hound had once fastened himself upright, she bowed her head and spoke a single line. To choose the ending is to write the whole story. Then she would turn and leave. She never stayed the night, not out of fear, but because she understood that sacred places do not belong to the living for long, and she was not the only one. A brother and sister, orphaned by one of the smaller border feuds still flickering in the hills, made a pilgrimage there once, guided only by the stories they'd half remembered. They stood in snow to their knees, their breath rising in small puffs, their hands clasped. They had lost everything. But when they looked at the stone, they did not feel empty. The boy, his voice hoarse, said, "He didn't wait for someone to save him." And the girl, younger, replied, "He became the thing that saves." In later years, she would become a healer. Her name would pass quietly from village to village, known not for miracles but for presence. Her hands steady, her words few, her silences deep. It was said that sitting in a room with her was sometimes enough to stop a man's grief from drowning him. She never claimed it was because of him, but she never denied it either. Far to the north, on a cliff that overlooked the sea, a poet once cast his finished scrolls into the wind. Not because he was done with them, but because he believed stories must sometimes return to the air they were born from. He watched as the pages flew, scattering over stone and surf. The final line, they say, was this: "The hound stands still even now, not on a hill, not on a battlefield, but in the hollow behind our ribs where courage waits to be remembered." And the wind carried that line far, carried it to villages where the story had never been sung, to lonely farms where mothers hushed their children with tales older than memory, to bards who had never heard his name, but found themselves writing of red cloaks and grey horses, and a man who bled like fire and would not kneel. In time, those stories would drift into new hands, and the shape of the tale would bend, of course, as all tales must. But at its heart something remained unchanging. Not the battles, not the deaths, not even the spear, but the standing. That moment, that final moment, where Cuchulainn, wounded, alone, bound to a stone, faced his death not as a supplicant, not as a sacrifice, but as himself, unmoving, unbroken. That moment became eternal, and in the depth of winter, when the sky held its light close and the world seemed made of ice and hush, that moment could be felt strongest. Not as memory, as presence, so that when a man or woman stood alone, whether in field or storm or sorrow, and chose not to flee, when they stood not because it would save them, but because it was right to stand, when they held their ground while all else trembled, it was said the Hound stood with them, not beside them, within them. For this is the truth behind all such myths, that the hero does not stay in the past. The hero becomes the silence before courage, the breath before battle, the stone within the chest that does not break. And in Ulster, in all the long years since, many have walked the fields where he fell, and though none have seen his face, many have walked away changed. When spring finally returned to Ulster, it came not in celebration, but in exhale, the slow, careful breath of the earth waking from long stillness. The frost melted gently, not hurried by the sun but released by it, as though the land had simply decided it was time to begin again, and in that thaw something deeper stirred. Not new life, but old memory. The grasses grew taller over the ford where Cuchulainn had once stained the river red. Trees budded again near the stone where he had fastened his dying body. Wildflowers, and soft blue and pale white, appeared in quiet clusters along the hill, not planted, not tended, just growing. There were no markers there, no stone tablets, no carved names, but the place remained known. Children were brought by hand, their mothers whispering warnings to be still. Lovers passed through it in silence, fingers laced. Old men left bits of bread or a sip of mead as tribute, not for gods, but for the man who had once held the sky in his chest and did not let it fall. And from time to time there came those who did not know why they had come. Wanderers, strangers, souls pulled by something they could not name. They stood on the hill in the warming wind, breathing in the hush of it, and understood without being told. This is where something immense happened. This is where someone chose not to break. This is where the line was drawn and held. And in that understanding, they too would change. Sometimes it was subtle, a quieter voice, a steadier hand, a decision not to yield when it would be easier to turn away, the kind of change that doesn't show, but remains. Because the lesson of Cú Chulainn was not about triumph, it was about bearing. He had carried the weight of his gasa, sacred bindings that bent his fate, not with complaint, but with clarity. He had accepted the cost before he ever drew his sword, and when the end came he met it not with bargaining or fear, but with decision. That choice, more than any victory, had been what shaped the land. In time, even the Morrigan grew quiet. She who had danced beside his doom, who had tested him in many guises, whose wings had circled overhead as the final spear struck, even she withdrew, not in defeat nor in mourning, but in respect. Some said her crows no longer cried in Ulster. Others claimed they came still, but only to sit silently upon the tomb at dusk, not as harbingers, but as keepers of watch. For even death, it seemed, had its heroes, and even gods pause where certain names have been spoken. The Red Branch Hall, long fallen into ruin, was not rebuilt. No stone was laid in its place, but travellers in the woods would sometimes come upon old outlines of foundation buried under moss and tree root, and hear the echo of laughter, of hooves, of steel against steel, not truly heard, but felt, as if the air, once thick with legend, still remembered how to sing. And so, in the long weave of time, the tale remained. In distant lands, across seas and centuries, the name of the Hound would surface in stories, changed, adorned, half lost. Yet always, the same image returned. A lone warrior on a blood-soaked field, wounded but upright. Bound to stone not to escape death, but to greet it standing. That image transcended language. It became a symbol, a shield in the heart. And sometimes, when those far from Ulster found themselves in moments of choice, moments where retreat was easy but standing was right, they would feel something settle into their spine, a memory not entirely their own, as though some ancient strength looked through their eyes, set their jaw and whispered, "Do not fall." For Cuchulainn had not fallen. He had risen, to meet the end on his own feet, and the land had made room for that truth, so that even now, when the wind moves gently across the fields where he last stood, the grass bends not in grief, but in recognition. In the deepest quiet of the year, that narrow breath between spring's first green and summer's full bloom, Ulster grew hushed again. Not with grief, not with fear, but with something softer. A kind of stillness that comes not from absence, but from presence too large to speak. And in this stillness the story came full circle, not with fanfare, not with ending, but with rest. The boy who had once watched Cuchulainn ride through his village, barefoot in the fields, wide-eyed and speechless, had grown old. His hair had gone to white and his back bowed like the wind had rested on it for too long. But his eyes remained clear, and every spring he would walk alone to the standing stone on the hill. He had outlived kings, outlived his children, outlived even the memory of war in some ways, but not the Hound, never the Hound. On this day, as he climbed the slope once more, he carried a small bundle wrapped in linen, not an offering, not a relic, just a folded bit of red cloth, aged and worn, had been his mother's. She'd tied it to a post when he was a boy, the day the chariot passed, whispering, "For protection," and now, finally, it would return. He knelt slowly by the stone, one hand pressed to its base. The other gently unwrapped the cloth and laid it flat in the grass, the edges fluttering faintly in the breeze. He did not speak. He had never spoken here. Words were too small for the weight he carried. After a long while he stood again and looked west, to the hills beyond the ford, to the land where the last battle had been fought, to the sky where the ravens once circled like stars. And then he smiled, a quiet, tired smile, because he could feel it, that same steady presence he'd felt as a child, when the earth itself had seemed to tremble beneath the wheels of the chariot. It was still here, still watching, still holding, and he was no longer afraid of anything. In the month that followed, others came. A young woman from the southern coast, carrying her infant son. A bard with more songs in his head than days left to sing them. A hunter whose hand had begun to tremble each time he drew an arrow, though it had never missed before. They did not know one another. They did not speak. But each, in their own way, came to the stone, laid down whatever weight they carried, and felt, if only for a moment, that they were not alone in bearing it. Because that was what remained. Not the hero's war, not the blood or glory or even the spear, but the gesture that a man in his final hour had bound himself upright, not to win, not to be seen, but to refuse surrender, to face what must come with stillness, with sovereignty and with open eyes. That gesture had become a map, and across the land others had begun to follow it. In small ways, quiet ways, not in battle, but in life, in choosing kindness where anger was easy, in protecting something fragile, though no one would ever know, in keeping a promise that hurt to keep, in standing, not tall, not proud, but simply standing when the easier thing was to kneel or vanish or break. The tale of Cuchulainn, the Hound of Ulster, was no longer just a story. It had become instruction. Even the youngest children knew the rhythm of it, though not always the details. They would play in the long grass, pretending to be warriors not in conquest but in defence, not of land but of those behind them. And when they tied themselves to trees with twine or cord, standing still while others ran and laughed, they did not mock. They reenacted something sacred, and their voices, small and bright, would ring out into the wind. "You'll not see me fall. I stand," and the land would hear, and the wind would carry it. And somewhere, in whatever realm old heroes go to rest, the hound would listen. Perhaps he would smile, perhaps not, for he had never stood for recognition, only for right. And now, long after his bones had become one with the earth, long after the last drop of his blood had returned to the river, his shape remained, not in flesh, but in the very structure of the world, a standing stone against time, a silence filled with strength, a name that breathes not loudly but deeply, Cú Chulainn, the one who stood when all else fell, the one who still stands even now in the quiet places of the soul. The sun set slowly that evening, as though Ulster itself had asked it to linger. Long streaks of gold and copper reached across the hills, brushing the river banks and treetops in a last farewell to daylight. The sky, so often grey with memory, softened into a clear warmth, and in that light the story settled again, like dust drifting down to earth. It had been years beyond counting since Cuchulainn had drawn his final breath, yet the land remembered. The bird still paused before taking flight over the hill of his last stand. Travellers, even those who didn't know the tale, felt something shift in their chest as they neared the tomb. A slowing of breath, a quieting of thought, a reverent stillness that needed no explanation. And now, on this evening, a druid came. Not one of old robes and ancient rites, not the kind who walked with staffs and called the storm, but a quiet man in weathered wool, eyes deep with listening, hands stained by bark and ink. He came with no procession, no followers, just a leather-bound satchel and the steadiness of someone who had walked a long way and never asked to be seen. He climbed the hill at dusk and sat beside the stone. The grass whispered around him, the wind light and low. He placed the satchel on the ground and opened it slowly as if unfolding memory itself. Inside were parchments, some old, some fresh, each marked with hand-drawn symbols, old Irish letters and diagrams shaped more like dreams than language. He'd studied the story not to explain it, for it needed no explaining, but to understand how it endured, how it had become more than myth, how it had slipped beneath the skin of the land and grown there like roots in stone. He laid a blank sheet across his lap, and he waited. Not for a vision, not for a voice, but for alignment, for the wind to pass just right, for the stone to rest at his back, for the hush to draw in around him, not as emptiness, but as invitation. Then he began to write, not the tale itself, that was already etched in hearts and bones. He wrote instead of the effect, of what it meant for a land to be marked not by victory but by choice, for a hero to become not a symbol of triumph but of stillness, for a death to become a compass. He wrote of the turning, that subtle shift that happens when a man chooses not to fight for himself but for the idea behind him, when the body gives way but the will does not. He called it the stand without end, and he wrote that it had changed him, not in ceremony, not in belief, but in direction. That when he had once thought the world was a place of rage and war, he had found instead that beneath all the fury there could be silence, and inside that silence there could be a man, and that man could stand, not because he must, but because he would. And in that standing the world could pause, could listen, could change. When he finished writing, night had fully arrived. The stars had come, and above him a raven passed quietly across the moon. He did not turn to look. He simply closed his eyes and breathed. He left the parchment at the base of the stone and walked down the hill without looking back. Days passed, then weeks. The parchment, though left to wind and rain, did not scatter. It stayed, somehow, edges curling, ink fading slowly but legible still. And those who came next found it. Some read it aloud, others simply touched it. But all who saw it took one thing with them, that it is not the battle that matters most. It is the bearing of it. It is the moment when a man, outnumbered and bleeding, ties himself to what he believes, not to live, but to face what must be faced, upright, calm, eyes open. Cuchulainn had done that, and in doing so he had given the land a shape, a centre, not of power, of presence, of witness, so that now, even as time rolled onward, even as stories shifted and tongues changed and maps redrew the old borders, there was still a point where silence met memory, where breath slowed, where the hill, the stone and the wind aligned once more. And when it did, something stirred again in the soul of the land, not loudly, but truly. The Hound still stood, and so could you. Summer reached Ulster like a lullaby, not rushed, not blazing, but gentle and sure, the way tides return to the shore. Days lengthened into golden hush, and the evenings glowed soft and amber as though lit from within. The hills breathed green again, their shadows long and slow-moving, and the rivers flowed clear, low and steady, like veins in the body of the land. It was in this season, warm, reflective, heavy with memory, that the people began to speak of quiet places, not sacred, not marked, not even known by name, just places where the wind changed, where thoughts softened, where one might feel, if only faintly, that something watched, not judging, not commanding, only being. And in these places, it was said, Cuchulainn passed, not in form, not in ghostly shape, but in presence. Because a life lived with such purpose does not disappear. It echoes, and echoes, when true enough, can become paths. Paths through the soul, through time, through silence. And so the Hound's path lived on, not paved, not lit, but deeply known. A path of standing when it is time, of not turning, of choosing the cost and paying it, fully, and then of resting. Even now, long beyond the years when his name was shouted in halls or carved in wood, his path remained, marked only by the hearts it shaped. There was an old widow in the north who walked the same trail each evening with a staff and no shoes. She never spoke of her grief, but each time she reached the edge of the woods she would pause, place her hand to the bark of a crooked tree and whisper, "I know what it is to stand," and then she would turn and go home. There was a young man who worked stone, building wells and hearths. He had never held a sword, but every morning, before picking up his hammer, he dipped his fingers in water and touched his brow with 2 words in the old tongue. Croí Calma, a brave heart. He never said why, but once, when asked, he said only, "The stone remembers him." And there was a girl, no older than 10, who watched her father fail at many things. She saw him bend, grow tired, lose crops, miss chances, but he never left. He stayed. He tried again. He kept his hands in the earth and his voice calm when he wanted to shout. And one day, when he wept alone, thinking himself broken, she placed her hand on his back and said, "You're like the Hound. You're standing still." He wept harder after that, but something in him straightened, because sometimes the greatest act of courage is not in the first battle. It is in the ones that come after, when the glory has faded and only the reason remains. And what had Cuchulainn stood for? Not pride, not conquest, but duty and vow, and fidelity to what matters most, even when it hurts. That was the final shape of his legend. Not the boy who slaughtered armies, not the hero who wielded a monster's spear, but the man who knew the terms of his end and stepped toward it anyway, upright, unshaking, and the world, watching him go, softened. It carried him not in songs of thunder, but in the quieter music that only lives in the long afterward, in the space after courage, where peace begins to settle, slow and deep. The Morrigan did not return, not visibly, but a single raven came each year, perched on the stone as the sun set on Midsummer's Eve, and stayed there until the last light faded. Those who saw it spoke of a strange feeling, as if time had folded in around that place and gone still, a moment not of mourning, but of agreement, of closure. And maybe, somewhere beyond the veil of time, the gods did what men never could, accepted that there are some mortals whose choices outlast even divine intent. Because fate is one thing, but will is another. And in the end, that was what the Hound had shown the world, that even if every path has an ending, what we choose along that path remains, not in stone, not in story, but in spirit, so that when the last light fades and the wind grows still, and someone, somewhere, is left with nothing but a moment to decide, they might remember and choose to stand. Dust settled over Ulster for the last time in this telling. It came slow and silver, a final exhale from a world that had held its breath too long. The sky deepened above the hills, not into darkness, but into velvet, the colour of still rivers and closed eyes. Stars pricked through, one by one, delicate as memory, quiet as ash, and the land was at peace. There, where the red branch once feasted, no torches burned. The halls had long crumbled into moss and root, their stones sunk back into the body of the earth, and yet the space still held warmth, like the memory of laughter, like the weight of stories told and retold until they become bone. No ruin is truly empty, especially not one that once held a name like his, Cuchulainn, the Hound of Ulster, the son of Lugh, the shield against the wave. But titles fell away now. They had served their purpose. They had drawn lines in the world so others might understand his shape. But here, in the quiet, in the end, there was only one shape that mattered. A man, alone, choosing, not for glory, not for song, but for truth. The truth that some things, some vows, some duties, some loves, are worth bearing beyond what the world allows, and when the bearing is too great and the strength has gone, the stance remains, upright, bound not by rope or ritual, but by the soul. And that was the soul of Ulster now, not the wars, not the blood, not even the tales, but the quiet stance of a figure who did not yield, and in that stillness, peace. The standing stone weathered centuries but never fell. Wind carved it gently, rain softened its edges, and moss gathered like time's caress. But it did not break. It remained, as he had, enduring, patient, part of the world now, not separate from it. And when the last who remembered his name had passed on, the stone still told the story. It told it to the wind, who carried it to the cliffs, to the sea, who murmured it into wave and tide, to the birds who flew it beyond the borders of old kingdoms into new hearts, new hands. And so, even now, it is said, when night falls and the land is quiet, when the world seems heavy and the sky too wide, if you sit in stillness and listen not with your ears, but with your breath, you may hear him. Not a voice, not a ghost, just the shape of a presence, just a moment of steadiness settling into your spine, a calm weight, saying only, you are not alone, you can choose, you can stand, and if you do, the land will know, and the wind will remember. And in the spaces between the stars where silence becomes story, Cuchulainn will remain, not fallen, not forgotten, just present, just still.